Greetings and salutations. Today we're going to look at the road to the Constitution. And this connects to one of the state standards about examining key documents connected to the government. And I know you've already read the Constitution and have done some examining of the document. And now we have to take kind of a step back and look at the controversies that are part of the story about how the Founding Fathers were able to put together this document that has lasted for hundreds of years. And one thing that I always think is very important to keep in mind is that when this Constitution was written, this is pre-electricity. Obviously pre-computers, pre-internet, and all of that. Yet somehow this document still works more than 200 years later. So we're going to look at some of the compromises. But before we get into that, you should notice there is a public opinion poll on this slide, and there are some scary facts about the general U.S. public's knowledge of the Constitution. So these stats are from a Zogby International survey, and according to the survey, only 42% of U.S. citizens could name the three branches, whereas 73% of them could name the Three Stooges. So I'll pause for a moment while you name the three branches and or the Three Stooges. Okay, go for it. Now, another big statistic that was in this survey was that apparently 87% of U.S. citizens could name at least one of the seven dwarves, but only 39% could name one Supreme Court justice. All right, so I'll pause for a moment again and try to name them. Okay, now in case you're keeping score, as far as the Supreme Court goes, there are 9 members, of course, and there's Kagan, Ginsburg, Sotomayor, the 3 women on the court, and there's Clarence Thomas, the lone African-American, and there's Antonin Scalia, Chief Justice Roberts, Kennedy, Alito, and Breyer. We'll be examining them in more depth later on in this unit. And of course, I would humbly suggest that it's more important for people to know about the Supreme Court justices because they're the ones, again, who interpret the Constitution. They're the ones who are going to decide, for example, whether or not abortion is legal or possibly what people's rights are when it comes to gun ownership. All right, but for now, I'll get off my soapbox and let's move on to the next slide. All right, so first I wanted to talk a little bit about the American Revolution before getting into those controversies. And of course, what hopefully has been drilled into your head from elementary school onward and with the benefit of good old schoolhouse rock as far as why does the American Revolution happen? And hopefully the phrase, no taxation without representation comes to mind. And this of course gets at the idea that the crown was taxing the colonists, but the colonists, of course, did not have a say in the government. Now, one of the reasons why, of course, the crown was taxing the colonists, other than the obvious fact that they were colonists, was because of the French and Indian War, or as the rest of the world knows it, the 7 Years' War. And England was victorious in this battle, in which it fought against primarily the French and some American Indians as well. And they wanted the colonists to pay for the war. So they raised taxes on a large variety of items. Now, in addition to taxation, another big motive behind the American Revolution was the Enlightenment. And we will be examining some of the famous Enlightenment philosophers later. But we're pretty much talking about people like John Locke and Montesquieu and Voltaire. And our founding fathers read their ideas and pretty much copied them into both the Declaration of Independence and then later the Constitution. Kind of as a subset of the Enlightenment, there was this idea that sort of connected to the scientific revolution where some of the colonists would say that England was so small and the colonies were so vast and that it was silly for such a large territory to rotate around a smaller territory, that England was so little. Now, another thing that's really interesting about the American Revolution was when we look at what was the level of support for the revolution. And for many years, we've been taught that, of course, support was mixed. John Adams estimated that it was basically one-third for the revolution, one-third against the Loyalists, and then one-third were either undecided or didn't care. And these stats have been repeated in numerous history books, but they have been challenged in the last few decades. And now many historians believe that perhaps as little as one-fifth of the people in the colonies were for the American Revolution, and perhaps as many as 50% did nothing to advance the revolution. And the idea is that some people didn't want to break away from England because it was the world superpower, and it was good to be part of the strongest empire on the planet at the time. There also started to be a growing sense that England needed the colonies more than the colonies needed England. The colonies were fairly self-sufficient, and England was making a lot of profits off of the colonies. Okay, real quick, I wanted to point out in that picture there, that's a famous drawing or engraving made by Paul Revere, and hopefully you can name that event. That is the Boston Massacre, which happened in 1770, and it really is an early example of propaganda. There was a grand total of 5 people killed, and there was lots of fighting going on between the colonists and the soldiers, and the crowd was getting unruly and perhaps even throwing things at them. And one thing that is interesting, that there actually was a former freed slave, Crispus Attucks, who was involved here, and you can sort of see him shot on the ground there, except Paul Revere depicted him as white instead of as African American. And, well, I'll let you figure out why. All right, so getting back to the slide, again, obviously the American Revolution is successful, and the Founding Fathers have this unique challenge. No one had ever broken away from an empire before. There was no blueprint to follow. There also were some big regional differences as far as what a new government should look like. And generally people in the North wanted a strong centralized government, and in the South they wanted kind of a weak national or federal government. And this again was largely tied to economics, because in the South farming was king and people were perhaps a little more self-reliant. And again, we'll examine this debate about a strong federal government and subsequent slides, and you're going to read about this in the famous Federalist and Anti-Federalist. But now let's move on to the next slide, and let's get into these controversies at the Constitutional Convention. And one of the biggies, of course, was who should have more power. As I just mentioned, the federal versus the state governments. And another issue that historians have discussed is whether or not the American Revolution was in fact radical or not. And the large majority, somewhere close to 70% of the signers of the Declaration of Independence had previously worked for the Crown. And these were people who were, of course, men, white, and wealthy. Okay, so as far as this discussion about strong federal versus weak federal government, those who want the strong federal government were known as the Federalists, surprising enough, and those who wanted a weak federal government were known as Anti-Federalists. Now, one thing that's important to keep in mind, if the state governments have more power than the federal government, then we can have 13 different laws about the same thing. As far as international trade goes, each country would have to negotiate a separate agreement with each state. Another big issue dealt with currency, that initially each state had its own currency, and this caused lots of problems as far as trade goes. So ultimately, what did the Founding Fathers decide in this federal versus anti-federal business? Ultimately, the Federalists sort of win, and we have a strong federal government. All federal laws trump state laws. As far as that next bullet there was a question about whether or not the legislative or the executive branch should have more power. John Locke, again, famous philosopher from the Enlightenment, he believed that the legislative branch should be the strongest because the people, in theory, would directly elect them. Now, ultimately, the Founding Fathers go with a different famous philosopher from the Enlightenment, good old Montesquieu, who you'll read about later. And Montesquieu was or at least he gets credit for being the person who developed the idea that there are three equal branches, that if there's only one branch, that people are prone to abuse power. It's too much power to be able to create laws, execute them, and to be the judge as well. So again, the Founding Fathers go with choice C, Montesquieu, and at least on paper, we have three equal branches. And hopefully you recall doing that chart about how the three branches balance one another. And if you haven't, please complete that and look it up, because I'm going to ask you on the next test, how do the three branches balance one another? All right, let's move on to the next slide. Yet another controversy at the Constitutional Convention. And this one, as you can see, there's the question of what should determine representation in the legislative branch. And the argument, of course, was whether this figure should be determined by population, which of course the larger states were in favor of, or should each state have an equal number of representatives. And just to make sure, when I'm talking about larger and smaller states here, we're talking about population, not geography. So ultimately, the solution here was formed from what was called the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise is that we have a bicameral legislative branch, as in there are two houses. We've got the Senate, which is equal representation, two per state, and then we have the House of Representatives, which of course is determined by population. And that's why Oregon only has five, five representatives, because Oregon is a fairly small population state. I believe the last figure, there was something like 4 million people. Now, another really big issue as far as determining population dealt with slavery. And of course, the South, where the majority of slavery was practiced, they wanted their slaves to count in the figures. And again, this is also why the census is done every 10 years, because the census will determine the number of representatives in the House. But back to slavery. So of course, the North was strongly opposed to allowing the South to count its slaves. And the North basically said to the South, you don't treat these people as human beings. If you're going to count them, then you have to treat them as human beings and give them rights and allow them to vote. And the South, of course, was not going to let that happen. The South was dependent upon slavery for its economy to work. And so ultimately the compromise that is reached is known as the 3/5 compromise, and the South is able to count 3/5 of the slave population. Now this is something that has become somewhat controversial, as you can imagine. The 3/5 figure came from previous compromises under the Continental Congress dealing with land taxation. And as you can probably imagine, people would say, oh, did they literally count a slave as 3/5 of a person? And that was very symbolic of racism. But technically, it was 3/5 of the aggregate population. So for every 5 slaves, they would count 3 of them. And it's also important to point out that while this did, of course, give the South a small boost initially in the House of Representatives, that in the long run, the population in the North grew much faster. So it really wasn't as big an advantage as one would initially think. Okay, let's move on to the next slide and continue this discussion about slavery. And one of the big questions that students often ask, and anyone for that matter, is why didn't the Constitution outlaw slavery? And the reason, of course, was that outlawing slavery was a deal breaker for the South. The South was not going to ratify any constitution that banned slavery, or as it was often referred to by the Founding Fathers, this quote-unquote peculiar institution. And one thing that's also interesting to note, if you look back at the Constitution, you do not see the word slave or slavery. Later on in the Bill of Rights, you see that when slavery is ended, but they technically don't use the word slavery. So give me a second, I'm going to fish out my Constitution so I can give you the exact words that they use. So we're looking here in the, where is it? Article 1, Section 9. And you can look at your Constitution app. All right, here we go. It says, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. But a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person. So again, they engage in some wordsmithing here, and they're describing slavery as migration, which is kind of horrible, since of course it's forced migration. Okay, but back to the compromise part here. Excuse me. So, as you can, perhaps if you heard there, the Constitution forbids making the slave trade illegal until 1808, but again, it's just talking about the slave trade, not the institution of slavery. And again, the reason why the North agreed to this was it wanted a capital U United States, and by describing it in terms of regulation of trade, this gave the North something that it desperately wanted, and they wanted the federal government to be able to regulate international trade and commerce, and this compromise gave it that power. And again, as you noticed, it did give the federal government the power to tax the slave trade. Now, and again, in exchange for this, another compromise the North had to give the South was in Article 4, and that article describes that any escaped slaves had to be returned to their masters. It was a felony to aid and abet escaped slaves. And then if you notice that picture, the one on the left shows a slave who had tried to escape, and often they had to wear those devices, these extremely long steel, I don't know what you call those, pipes attached to a collar, which would make it very difficult, of course, for them to escape through a fence or to gain any degree of comfort. And then that slide on the right, photo on the right, is probably the most famous picture of a slave who had been whipped. And again, this issue of slavery is obviously very controversial, and there are some historians who cite this failure to get rid of slavery as an example of why the American Revolution and the Constitution itself are not radical, because groups like the slaves and women and American Indians, and to some extent the poor, their rights were completely ignored. And this is one of the most abhorrent practices ever. But I also must admit that the Founding Fathers were able to reach a compromise about the ownership of human beings. And if we look at our current Congress, they are incapable of, well, they at least seem to be incapable of compromising on anything. And I don't mean to imply that one should compromise and allow slavery, but just this notion that compromise is one of the most important aspects of government. But unfortunately, with compromise, sometimes each side loses. Okay, I'm going to get off my high horse here, and let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so this next controversy deals with the need for a Bill of Rights. And this was a huge part of the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, which you're going to read about after this terribly exciting PowerPoint. Okay, so from the Federalist perspective, they argued that it was not necessary for there to be a Bill of Rights because every state already had one. Now, the Anti-Federalists said, while that is true, there still had to be a federal Bill of Rights because, if you recall from an earlier slide, federal law is going to trump state law. So their concern was, if there was not a federal Bill of Rights, then the federal government could perhaps encroach upon these individual rights that were supposed to be guaranteed to each citizen. So the result is the adding of the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And this was essential towards gaining the ratification of this document. Now, I put that piece of graffiti there in the bottom left about free speech, partially because I think it's cool, but also just as a reminder with this idea that while we do have rights and freedoms, that there are limits on them. And part of that, of course, is by design. There has to be some limit. You can't just say anything you want without consequence. That's not what freedom means in a government sense. That would be anarchy. There have to be limits to protect everybody's rights. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so this slide raises a controversy that often gets ignored, but there really was a question about whether or not the delegates to the Constitutional Convention had the authority to write a new constitution for the nation. And technically, they did not have the power to do this. They were just supposed to meet and revise the Articles of Confederation, which was the previous sort of constitution, if you will. They did not have the explicit permission to create a new government. And this is one of the reasons why that's a famous painting there in the bottom right of the Founding Fathers doing their thing. They met in the summertime in Pennsylvania, and I don't know if any of you have been to the East Coast in the summertime, but it's crazy hot and crazy humid, and you can see how they're dressed, covered head to toe, of course, and they kept the windows closed and the curtains drawn, and they did not allow reporters into the sessions because they were afraid that if the general public caught wind of some of these debates and compromises, and even just the fact that they were writing a new government, that there could be another revolt. And so they tried to keep their discussions on the down low and to prevent outsiders from learning what the debates were about. Now again, Madison took extensive notes, but many other of the delegates, they did not take notes because they were afraid, again, that people would find out about the controversies. And then you can see there on the left, that's another famous Banksy piece. Keep your coins, I want change. And I feel like in a way that kind of was what the whole convention was about. The current system was not working. There had to be a stronger federal government in order to keep the nation together. All right, let's tackle the final controversy of the Constitutional Convention, and this, of course, is a biggie. And the issue was, who should pick the President of the United States? And again, there was lots of concern about the President acting like a king, and that's why the checks and balances was created, and that's why there were lots of limitations placed on the power of the presidency, and etc. You've already read about that. So again, how was the president going to be chosen? Now, it's important to keep in mind that the majority of Founding Fathers were wealthy and well-educated. And to be quite frank, many of them were afraid that the common people were too dumb to make such an important choice. And so to try to perhaps limit the power of the people, the Electoral College was created. And the Electoral College was sort of like a filter between the popular votes and the winner of the election. So again, technically, each state has a number of electors that is determined by the number of representatives and senators the state has. And they're supposed to follow the popular votes, although the Constitution does not require them to do so. And again, the whole point of that is that, let's say the public made a horrible choice, then the Electoral College, in theory, could correct that. Now, it's also important to note that in the history of presidential elections, there have been a grand total of 3 where the Electoral College and the popular vote didn't match. And the most recent and perhaps most controversial one occurred in 2000 with George W. Bush and Al Gore, There's a lot of controversy in that election, partially because Florida was one of the deciding factors um, of the victory for Bush. And at the time, George Bush's brother Jebediah was the governor of Florida. And this did ultimately go to the Supreme Court. And again, we will be looking at that case a little bit later, so I don't want to spill all the beans. The only other two times when the popular vote and electoral college did not match up were in the 19th century. And we have to go all the way back to 1876 of Hayes versus Tilden and 1888 of Harrison versus Cleveland. So again, of all of these presidential elections, only 3 has there been a disparity between the popular vote and the electoral college. Now, it's still very controversial because many people, especially in the West and in states like Oregon, believe that we don't get represented in the election for the presidency. We don't have a lot of electoral votes, so there's the presidential candidates rarely pay a lot of attention to Oregon. Later on, you're going to actually write a persuasive essay about this topic, about whether or not we should keep the Electoral College or whether it should be abolished. Before we move on to the big finale here, I just wanted to point out that that device you see at the center of this slide, that is a voting booth. And if you live in Oregon, you will never see one of those. Because in Oregon, as I said before, and I'll say it many more times, they mail the ballot to your house. Yes, they actually mail it to your house, and you can either mail it back or you can drop it off at the library. In Portland, you can even drop it off at like McDonald's. I kid you not. They have lots of public places for you to drop off your ballots. So again, I strongly encourage you to participate in the electoral process. I cannot say how important it is for you to be an informed voter and to share your voice. Now, if you're going to be an uninformed person, then please don't vote, and we'll just leave it at that. Okay, on to the final slide. So, why does the Constitution work? Again, this is a very important question, and of course, I will be asking you this on the next test. So first we start with the necessary and proper clause, and you previously looked at this with that examine the Constitution chart. And pretty much the necessary and proper clause gives the government the power to put laws into place. And some examples of that, the Constitution gives the Congress the power to build an army, but it doesn't specifically say how it can build an army. So the draft is an example of the necessary and proper clause. The Constitution gives Congress the power to create the post office, but it doesn't say anything about stamps. So of course the government can create postage stamps to make the mail system work. And of course they're allowed to hire mail carriers, but of course it doesn't say that in the Constitution, that they can hire mail carriers. Regulating currency, that's another power given in the Constitution. And part of the necessary and proper clause has been to build a federal bank. Also, of course, the Constitution gives Congress the power to collect taxes, but it doesn't specifically say that it can punish people who don't pay taxes. So those punishments are an example of the necessary and proper clause. And last but definitely not least, one of the most important examples deals with school desegregation. The Constitution does not give Congress or the president the power to do that, but in the spirit of creating equality, what our country is supposed to represent, the government, of course, can force schools to, and did force schools to desegregate. Okay, let's see, where are we? So that's the supremacy clause. Okay, now another huge example of why the Constitution still works, and that's often referred to as, quote-unquote, a living document. And what this means, of course, is that the Constitution can be amended. We can change it to adjust with the times. As I said at the beginning, this document was ratified back in 1789. It's 2014. We still use it. How is that possible? Well, partially because, again, it can be changed. And some of the more notable amendments, of course, include giving women the right to vote. And that technically didn't happen until 1920. That's so hard to believe. Another big amendment, of course, was ending slavery, creating an Equal Voting Rights Act, changing the voting age to 18. There are numerous examples of how the Constitution has been changed over the years. Now, again, as you know, the Bill of Rights includes the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and there are a grand total of 27 amendments. And the last amendment happened in the early 1990s that dealt with congressional pay. Now, another way that the Constitution still works is this whole notion of there are different ways that it can be interpreted. And we'll dive into this when we zoom into the judicial branch. But basically, there are two schools of thought. One that is called elastic and one that is called strict. And with the elastic interpretation, Supreme Court judges try to ascertain what was the intent of the Founding Fathers, or what was the intent of a given law. Whereas the strict interpretation says, the Constitution says blank, there is no room for interpretation. That's what it says, that's what it means. And the classic example of this deals with the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Now, technically, wait, let me pull out my Constitution here. The Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms should not be infringed. And the strict people say, it says, right of the people to keep and bear arms. That means that people can have machine guns, Uzis, I guess that's a machine gun. Well, you get the idea. They can have all the guns they want. And the elastic interpretation might say, well, it's talking about a well-regulated militia. This doesn't mean that people get to have machine guns. And we'll again revisit this debate later. But again, the way that the Constitution and the way that laws are interpreted can change. And another very important example of that deals with abortion, or right to life versus right to choose. And depending upon the composition of the courts, the right to abortion could go away. And obviously, this is a very controversial and divisive issue. Some people want it to stay into place. Some people want it to stay into place, but has some limitations. And some people want it completely taken away. And here's another reason why it's so important to vote for the president, because the president is the one who nominates the Supreme Court justices. So again, depending upon who gets to make those choices, can affect one's rights. Okay, well, that concludes our road to the Constitution. I hope this wasn't too terribly boring. I wanted to leave you with this last picture, as you can see. That's the National Archives, and that is where the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are kept, behind bulletproof glass. And if you ever go to DC, I highly encourage you to go visit it. And if I was there, we would be having a discussion about the movie National Treasure with Nicolas Cage. And yeah. Alright, so again, thanks for listening. If you have questions, please email me, and we'll wrap it up with a picture, rather a video of cats, because why not? Thanks and take care.